Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Before we get onto the subject of today's episode in our series about pivotal UK elections, I want to let you know that a bonus episode is available now about the amazing election of 1924. If you want to hear them in chronological order, you need to sign up to PPF Plus. You will get all our bonus episodes, ad-free listening, and you will hear Robert Saunders and me talking about what happened in 1924 and why it really connects to now. Here's a taster.
I think if we're looking for parallels with the 1920s, then perhaps it is that sense that what we think is politically possible is changing almost by the month. So it's not very long ago that sensible political commentators were saying it's going to be very, very difficult for Labour to win a majority of any kind at all, because it needs one of the largest swings in electoral history simply to get a majority of one. And we are now broadly taking for granted that the question is, where will it sit in the Guinness Book of Records in relation to election wins? And I think that might perhaps be a warning to us about being too certain about the political times that we live in. If it is indeed the case that Labour wins a spectacular victory at this election, then it will have ripped up the political rule book. And that means it will be very difficult to predict what follows that, because the political rules can't simply reassert themselves the moment that ballot boxes have closed. If there can be a swing on this scale to Labour in 2024, it must at least be possible that there is an equivalent shift against Labour very shortly after that. And that would be extraordinarily disorientating for all of us. But that was the world that politicians were trying to navigate in 1922, 1923, and 1924.
If you'd like to hear that episode, go to ppfideas.com or just click on the link in our show description. It's very easy to sign up. Today's episode is about the Great Labour Landslide of 1945, the first ever Labour landslide. A landslide means that the ground moves. It moves one way, it can move another way too. The 1945 election is unique in lots of ways, I think. It is the first Labour majority, and boy, it's a thumping majority. It's an election that happens in wartime. So the war in Europe is over, but the Second World War is still ongoing. It's still 2 months out from victory in the Pacific. But also, it is the longest gap between general elections in British parliamentary history, modern parliamentary history, actually since the beginning of the 19th century. It's a 10-year gap since the voters have had their say. So 1935 was the last one. 1945, that's a long time. And obviously for 6 of those years, Britain has been a country at war, and from 1940 onwards, governed by a national government, which is a combination of Conservative and Labour politicians, Winston Churchill at its head, Clement Attlee as his deputy prime minister. What had happened to party politics? I genuinely don't know the answer to this question. What had happened to party politics in that period? Had it gone into abeyance? Was it frozen? Or was it still bubbling away under the surface so that people, when the election was called by Churchill, could kind of snap back into action? Or did it really require a kind of cranking up of the old habits from politicians who had been working together pretty damn successfully on the key issue, which was to win the war, for 5 years, for the length of a normal parliament?
So there had been an electoral truce between the two parties since 1940, so they didn't put candidates up against one another in by-elections. Interestingly, some sort of rebel left-wing parties did put up candidates and were highly successful, which ought to have been a sign to the Conservatives of what was to come. But the two parties from 1940 were in coalition with one another. Clement Attlee was in fact Deputy Prime Minister from 1942 onwards. So a world in which the two parties are tearing lumps out of one another, presenting the other as a risk to national security or as a danger to national prosperity, is a wildly different world from the one in which many of these politicians have been operating over the previous 5 years.
When we talked about 1906, you said that before the age of opinion polls, by-elections were actually your best guide to the state of public opinion. There were an awful lot of by-elections in the war period from 1939 to 1945, but from 1940 onwards, they were uncontested. So I think the understanding was the party that held the seat simply nominated a candidate. There might have been some maverick opposition, but I think in almost every case, the party that held the seat retained the seat. So that was no guide, though there might have been rumblings from these maverick candidates. On the other hand, it is true that governments that are no longer mandated by electoral politics, and this is true of autocrats around the world, and it was an autocratic government from 1940 to 45, are very interested in public opinion, precisely because they don't have the ballot box to access it. And that's certainly true of the British government. The British government was, all governments in wartime have to be intensely interested in morale. This was the age of mass observation. This was the era in which the government did whatever it could to try and sense the national mood. It needed to be hyper alert to the possibility of morale or pessimism taking hold. Did that mean that they did have a sense? Because we're going to be talking about the extent to which 1945 was a shock, and it was a shock in lots of ways. But there were also many, many straws in the wind. There was also opinion polling, I believe, in this period. So the Gallup organization existed in the United States. Opinion polling was pretty crude, and there had been some disastrous examples of how polls don't tell you what's going to happen in elections in America. But the polling that I've seen through 1942, 43, 44 gave the Labour Party consistently 15-point leads over the Conservatives. So when Churchill called the election, he seemed to think he was going to win. I mean, I think he thought he was going to win because he just won the war. But the signs were everywhere that that was far from a foregone conclusion.
Yes, it's a reminder that it's quite difficult to see the world clearly when you're standing in the middle of it. It wasn't just Churchill who thought he was going to win. Almost everyone thought he was going to win. I think the Financial Times said that Mr. Churchill and his party will be returned is practically taken for granted. The point of uncertainty is the sum of the majority. But as you say, there was a lot of opinion polling evidence that pointed not just to a Labour victory, but to a huge Labour victory. Polls had consistently had Labour 18 points ahead in the early months of 1945. There's a poll by Gallup just before the election, which is almost exactly spot on. I think it has Labour on 48%, the Conservatives on 39.6%, and the Liberals on 9%. And there had been a small number of losses at by-elections from the Conservatives to what looked like proxy versions of the Labour Party. But partly because polling was new, it wasn't widely believed, it wasn't widely trusted. There had been a recognition that a lot of the government polling done during the war had been practically worthless. If a man with a clipboard turns up at your door when you're at war and says, do you trust the government? How is your morale at the moment? Your tendency is to say, oh, absolutely, my morale is doing fine. So there were quite good reasons why people had become suspicious of opinion polling. And of course, they were showing approval ratings for Mr. Churchill of around 83%. So in some ways, it feels rather like a blissful period compared to the present election in which people are not obsessing about polls all the time. But had they been looking at them a little bit more closely, there were signs of pebbles bouncing down the side of the hill that a landslide might be coming.
It was Churchill's government. It was a coalition government, but this was a war. It was a total war. And in total war, you don't just get mass mobilization, you get enormous state control of the economy. You have to govern, even if you're Winston Churchill, the arch anti-socialist of British politics, as a kind of socialist prime minister. You have to do things that would be anathema. In an emergency, in a war, politicians do whatever they need to do, and Churchill did what he needed to do. So you have a government which is a Churchill-led government. It's a coalition. When the election is called in 1945, he wants to stand on his record. His record is we won the war. But there's another record here too, which is what had to be done to win the war. And then, of course, there is the question as, is this a war election or is this a peace election? And I think in the end, that is the central question in the campaign. I read the Labour manifesto for 1945, which is it's a fascinating document. It must be the best written party manifesto of them all. It's elegant and it's surprisingly discursive. It's not particularly long, but it makes its pitch very clear up front. First, It says, we respect Mr. Churchill for everything that he's done. And by the way, we remind you, we, the Labour Party, put him in. We were the ones who helped get rid of Chamberlain. So don't forget that. But then what it wants to say is, remember who these people were before the war. That is the absolutely central pitch. Don't think that the government that you've had since 1940 is a typical Conservative government. It is a completely atypical government. Indeed, it's closer to the kind of thing that we are offering you. And above all, remember how the peace went last time. Remember how the peace was lost in 1918. So what it tries to say, it's about the future. It's a pitch for the future, but actually its central message is remember the past. And remember how you were governed in the 1930s, and particularly from 1935, but also remember what happened, the Lloyd George Conservative coalition after 1918, which squandered the peace essentially by selling it out to the predatory capitalists. That was the message.
Right. So there's a few things to pull out there. So firstly, I think you're absolutely right that the conduct of the war had completely transformed the state and a lot of assumptions about politics. The government had spent the last 6 years running a planned economy. At the moment at which you need your economies be performing to maximum capacity to meet a national emergency, what do? The state steps in and it takes control of the commanding heights of the economy and it directs and plans all of your major industries. It's very difficult after that to say that socialism is an economic fantasy and is dangerous to the country. That's a big shift in Labour's favour. Secondly, the government's been taking on all kinds of new welfare responsibilities. It's set up an emergency medical service, which in all sorts of ways prefigures the National Health Service, because old systems of health insurance have just broken down when people are moving around the country or when their streets been bombed and no one's quite sure who they are. At the same time, governments have been thinking about reconstruction. And they've been coming up with plans that look very like the sorts of things that the Labour Party has been calling for in the 1930s. The Beveridge Report in 1942 isn't just a really important moment in social policy, it's a bestseller. It's exempted from the paper ration. And the result of that is it sells something like 500,000 copies in its first 6 months. And it's written in an exciting style for a popular audience. So the net effect of this is really to dismantle the case that the Conservatives have been making in the 1930s. So their case had been, we will protect you from the Labour Party who want to do dangerous socialist things. Now they're doing those socialist things. They're saying, we are the party that can run the economy most efficiently. Well, they had presided over mass unemployment when the experience of war suggested that that was a choice. They had said in the 1930s, we are the party that will keep you safe. Whereas in fact, they appeared to have appeased Hitler and left Britain undefended. Now, those allegations might in all sorts of ways be deeply unfair, but they're very politically powerful. And we can see actually in those polls we talked about, as early as 1940, very big swings against the government and against its handling of the country in the 1930s. So it's going to be very difficult for the Conservatives to say, let's go back to 1938, which is partly why they go so heavily on Winston Churchill and questions of foreign policy.
Churchill himself had a long history, including as Chancellor of the Exchequer back in 1925. And one of the things that the Labour Party, I think, wanted to remind people of, and Attlee did it explicitly in one of his radio broadcasts, is there are two Churchills. There is peacetime Churchill, and peacetime Churchill is frankly a disaster. His judgment is erratic, to put it mildly, and his record is patchy, to put it even more mildly. And then there is wartime Churchill. So wartime Churchill clearly has certain things that no other British politician had, and he was the saviour of his nation. But now the war is over. When, in one of the radio broadcasts, Churchill makes, I don't know if this is the first gaffe, I don't know if this counts as the first gaffe, but it's sort of considered an early version of the genre of the gaffe, where he tells his listeners that, I paraphrase it here, but if Attlee gets in and the Labour programme is enacted, the British people should prepare themselves for a kind of Gestapo, which is way over the top, completely counterproductive, seems to go against the entire spirit of the working arrangement he'd had with this man during the war. And Attlee's response is to tell his radio listeners, here is the difference between wartime Churchill and peacetime Churchill. What you heard last night, he tells his audience, is peacetime Churchill. Wild, erratic, profoundly partisan, deeply anti-socialist. And we're now a country at peace. It's an incredibly powerful message, actually.
Yes. The question for the electorate in 1945 wasn't, do you approve of Churchill's leadership of the war effort? It was, do you want Mr. Churchill leading the peace? And as you suggest, that was a radically different question. And the famous Gestapo broadcast, or his crazy broadcast, as it's also known at the time, really illustrates that point. There was always a sense with Churchill that his rhetoric constantly inflated the threat in front of him. Whatever he was talking about, whether it was the post office or Gandhi or strikes before the First World War or the people's budget, he always set it up as this great collision of cosmic forces in which good strives against evil and the fate of the universe is in the balance. And in the Second World War, he found a threat that matched his rhetoric, and that made him the great orator of the 20th century and the great articulator of the case against fascism. But he can't turn that off. So when he goes into electioneering mode, he gives this extraordinary broadcast on the 4th of June, in which he says, socialism is inseparably interwoven with totalitarianism. No socialist government could afford to allow free, sharp, or violently worded expressions of public discontent. They would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo, no doubt very humanely directed in the first instance. Now, as you say, this is the man who has been his deputy prime minister throughout the war years. Clement Attlee is a man who had been decorated for valour in the First World War. Whatever you think of this man, the idea he's going to lead a Gestapo is absurd. And it's a gift to Attlee, because in his reply the next day, he can say that Churchill had done a kind act. He said he wanted the electors to understand how great was the difference between Winston Churchill, the great leader in war of a united nation, and Mr. Churchill, the party leader of the Conservatives. I thank him for having so thoroughly disillusioned the electorate.
The memories of the 1930s were still strong, so they hadn't been erased by the war. As you say, if anything, they had been reinforced by the war, because what the war had done was to give a practical demonstration that it didn't have to be that way. And the Conservative Party at this period, in the memory of not every elector, because some of them would have been young, but the vast majority of the electorate, was the party of Baldwin and Chamberlain. It was the party that had seen the country through, but very unsuccessfully, the Great Depression. It was the party, as you say, that had appeased Hitler. That memory was in no sense erased by the war.
No, I think it really was sharpened by it. And Churchill himself actually contributes to that. In his History of the Second World War, which he published in 1948, there's a famous index entry, Baldwin, Stanley admits to putting party before country, which is a reference to a speech that Baldwin had given, which became known as his appalling frankness speech, in which he said, let me speak with appalling frankness. If we had gone to the country in 1935 and said we really need to rearm against Germany, we would have lost, so we couldn't possibly say it. So that shatters the Conservatives' claim to have been the patriotic party before the election. And then on the economy, there had been quite wide recognition in the 1930s, rightly or wrongly, that the British economy was suffering from global forces beyond its control and that the Conservatives were doing as competent a job as anybody at managing it. Much harder to make that case by 1945, when you've been running full employment all the way through the war. And you mentioned the Labour Manifesto, which we should talk more about because it's a wonderful document. It really pushes that line hard. It says the great interwar slumps were not acts of God or of blind forces. They were the sure and certain result of the policy choices made by the Conservatives in the 1930s. And that is why we must not go back to that world in 1945.
As you said, the Beveridge Report was a bestseller. The manifesto was not a bestseller, but it was extremely widely read, widely distributed, and widely read. I don't know how many people have read the 2024 Labour Manifesto. I've read it. It's not even a manifesto, actually. It's a sort of online something. But this was it's not that long, the 1945 Manifesto. I think people should read it. We'll let people know where they can read it. It's elegantly written. What I'm not clear is how radical a document it was, because it does have different strands in it and it has different rhetorical elements to it. So a lot of it is designed not to frighten the electorate. and to remind them that a lot of this is now the centre ground of politics. The consensus has shifted here post-Beveridge, and a lot of the things that are being proposed are to ensure and to protect what people have come to rely on, and then to strengthen them and then to deepen them. But it also has a very interesting passage right in the middle where it reminds the readers, we are proud socialists. Don't think this is anything other than socialism. This is in the section on the nationalisation of industry, which is pretty hard-hitting. We're going to nationalise a lot. And, you will be electing us to create what it calls the socialist Commonwealth of Great Britain, which is a less, I think, wartime consensual idea. It is unabashedly socialist. Do you have a sense of which of these strands dominates? I mean, it feels like the consensual bit dominates, but it doesn't shy away from the other.
It's a manifesto that would have looked a lot more radical in 1935 than it did in 1945. And I think that reminds us of the importance of context here. It's mostly written by a 29-year-old Labour staffer called Michael Young, who goes on to become one of the great sociologists of the late 20th century, the man who invents the term meritocracy. And on one level, it's an optimistic document. It's even called Let Us Face the Future. It's about going forward and building a better world as a reward for the people. And it begins with a really bold claim, which is it says, this war will have been won by its people, not by any one man. And it's very clear who it has in mind there. It recognises Churchill's leadership, but Churchill did not win the war. The British people won the war, and therefore the people must be rewarded. But it uses that as the basis for kind of recasting itself, I think, less as a socialist party than as a national party. I think the word socialist appears about 3 times in the manifesto. The word national appears 56 times. It's all about a national health service, national insurance, nationally owned industries. And what it's able to do, because of the war experience, is to say these aren't the demands of an insane, radicalised working class. This is about bringing together a nation that has won the war collectively owning our industry, collectively planning our economy, collectively looking after one another in all of the vicissitudes of life, from cradle through to grave. And that's also important because it means it's harder to cast this as the expression of a foreign ideology, which is how it had always been pitched in the 20s and 30s, when you can now say this is actually about the kind of collective achievement of the British people. So it's got that strong kind of ethical dimension and that strong ethical message, but it's also got a lot of policy meat in there, much of which has actually been drawn up in the 1930s, but which has become conventional wisdom as a result of what's happened during the war.
And that phrase, the socialist Commonwealth of Great Britain, so socialist stands out, but also Commonwealth. The really radical doctrine would have been the Socialist Republic. They weren't going anywhere near that. Commonwealth has a very different tradition. And as you say, that's in the nationalisation section. It lists the industries that will be nationalised. There's a section on full employment. There's a relatively short section on health. I was surprised, actually, given that the flagship policy achievement for many British people still of the Attlee administration is the creation of the National Health Service. It's just a couple of paragraphs. And interestingly, it really emphasises that this is a health service for children. I think one of the really interesting things about the NHS is it was created for children and it now exists for old people, which is one of the problems that it faces, because 1945, Britain was a population that skewed heavily young, and now we skew heavily old. So it's very, very different kinds of health demands. The manifesto was widely read. Do we nonetheless, or do I, overstate its significance in electoral terms? In manifestos now, I think it's thought manifestos now have no impact unless, as in 2017, there's a commitment in the manifesto that is able to be used by the opposition as meat for a kind of monstering politics. It was social care in 2017, but it's not like anyone reads a manifesto now and thinks, oh, I thought I was one of these people, but I've now read their manifesto and I'm now one of these people. Do we know whether this one really did impact the electorate and how they were thinking?
So, first of all, the dividing line in this election isn't really welfare, which is how we tend to remember it. Both parties are promising some kind of welfare state. Both parties are promising a nationalised health system. They might disagree in some of the details, but the principle is fairly similar. Where they disagree radically is on how you manage the economy. So Labour is very explicit, as you say, that it is going to carry forward wartime planning into the peace. This is going to be a planned, rationalised economy, whereas the Conservatives are pushing much more for a return to the free market. And in fact, one of the interesting features of the election is that Labour is handing out copies of the Beveridge report, while the Conservative Party uses its paper ration to print copies of Hayek's Road to Serfdom, which is this hugely important text published in 1944 that becomes very significant in the 70s onwards, which argues that at the moment of victory in Europe, we are starting down the road to a new form of totalitarianism because of economic planning. So that really is the difference between the two parties at this point. And Labour is in the happy circumstance of being able to defend the status quo. It wants to carry forward things that the state is already doing in wartime. In terms of how the public responds, it's very hard to know, of course, and it's a hotly debated point among historians. Were the public excited by the Labour Party, or were they apathetic? There's quite a lot of evidence that people in this period didn't trust politicians, that they didn't expect promises to be kept, that they might admire what it says in the manifesto, but they had no great hopes that it would come about. We should think about public opinion in this period in terms of hoping against hope, that they are hoping for a better world, but are deeply uncertain about whether it's actually possible. The hope itself is important. The hope is a political act, but you also recognise you're scarred by the experiences of the past. You're uncertain about whether your neighbours and your fellow voters are going to rise to this particular challenge. So we have this tug between hope and pessimism, which characterises a lot of the response to the campaign.
The Labour Party has always been, I don't think this is a controversial thing to say, an organisation that is capable of factionalism. And presumably in this period, there were a number of people, including a number of members of parliament, who would have wanted a more radical document. As you say, there were some rogue left parties or proxy versions of the Labour Party who broke the pact during the war and stood in by-elections and showed there was an appetite for a more radical politics. Was Attlee sitting on top of something that was, yep, you're a guy and we're here behind you, and if you win this thing, we will be with you? Or was the Labour Party at this period at least potentially capable of being quite divided on many of the policies in this manifesto? How broad a church was it, and how much infighting was there in that church?
Well, the Labour Party is, of course, a party founded on the principles of solidarity and fraternity and brotherhood, which means its members fight like sacks of cats. It's always been a party riven by factionalism, partly because it's charged with moral energy. There is a sense that the arguments you're having really matter, that you're building towards a better world, and anything that stands in that way must be removed. And that certainly doesn't go away in this period. Many of Attlee's cabinet ministers can't stand one another. There's a wonderful story that someone said of Herbert Morrison, that he was his own worst enemy. And Ernie Bevan piped up, "Not while I'm alive, he's not." So even within the cabinet, you've got very difficult personal relationships. And you've got quite fractious groups in the party that, particularly after they've won this shocking great majority in 1945, want to use it to go further and faster. We often forget that for much of the left, for decades after 1945, the Attlee government was regarded as a betrayal. A government that had had an opportunity for social renewal and had thrown it away, fighting foreign wars, building the nuclear bomb, accommodating itself to a conservative climate of opinion. It's only really in retrospect, partly because other Labour governments have failed to match its radicalism, that it's come to be seen as the great transformational government of the 20th century.
And how did his colleagues think of Attlee himself? Churchill was always, certainly capable of being pretty withering about him and his emptiness as a politician. Were they suspicious?
Well, you could fill an encyclopedia with rude quotes about Attlee. A modest little man with much to be modest about, a sheep in sheep's clothing, an empty taxi drew up and Attlee got out. And some of those do come from members of the Labour Party. Hugh Dalton called him a little mouse. Beatrice Webb called him this little nonentity. He had become leader in 1935, really because of a lack of alternatives. And even on the day that Labour formed a government in 1945, there was an attempt to remove him and replace him with someone else. And Ernie Bevan famously said to him, "Clem, get off to the palace right now." And he did, and formed his government. So I think it would have been difficult to predict in the late 1930s that this was going to be the man held up as one of the great prime ministers of the 20th century. But actually, he did have an enormous number of assets, both as a prime minister and as a campaigner. So first of all, he was absolutely bulletproof on an issue that's always been very difficult for the Labour Party, which is patriotism. This is a man who had been a soldier in the First World War, who had been decorated for valour, and for most of the 1930s, he would have been referred to by his military title, Major Attlee. He had then been Churchill's deputy during the Second World War, so you really can't run the campaign against him that Conservatives like to run against Labour leaders, which is that he's unpatriotic and hates his own country. So that's one advantage. Secondly, he is visibly and manifestly middle class. So unlike Keir Starmer, his father was not a toolmaker. His father was a prosperous solicitor who sent his son to Haileybury College and Oxford University. If you watch Pathé news clips of Attlee, he just exudes middle-class respectability. He's got quite a clipped voice and accent. He's got a trimmed moustache. He looks a bit like a bank manager. You just cannot look at this man and think, here is a revolutionary and a subversive. But what he did have was an intense social conscience. This was a man who had grown up as a Tory, but who had then done social work in the East End of London. And that had changed his life. And his politics was founded in a deep sense of obligation and duty to working people, particularly in the East End of London. So when he talked about socialism as a cross-class ideology, something that well-to-do people should believe in because of its moral justice, he was talking about people like himself. So in a sense, he embodied the kind of voter that Labour was trying to win in 1945. And then finally, although he's not charismatic himself, he's very good at managing people who are. So there's probably never been a cabinet with more awkward and difficult people in it than the 1945 cabinet. And there have been very few prime ministers better at handling that kind of personal situation.
And how did the electorate encounter him in 1945? So this was very much a radio election. Radio, I think, is the central medium of communication along with newspapers. It's a newsreel election. It's not yet, I think, in any meaningful sense, a television election. So how would people have encountered this comforting middle-class personality?
Very much, as you say, through radio and through news clips that will be shown in the cinema. And actually, there's some evidence that the public didn't particularly like having their films interrupted by party political broadcasts. But nonetheless, there they were. You've got to sit through them. So you get some exposure to Mr. Attlee in that form. And of course, if you want charisma, if you want someone who's going to stir up the crowd and address the big mass meeting, there are plenty of other people in the Labour Party who can do that. You've got Bevin and Bevan. So the campaign is less centred on one person than, say, this year's election is. There is more of a sense that you can deploy different members of your team to different audiences.
And it was a wartime election, so a large part of the electorate are still under arms. This is a soldiers' election. A large number of the people who are standing for Parliament are still in uniform. Many of the candidates appear in uniform, and just as much on the Labour side as on the Conservative side. How did that shape this? I mean, for a start, how did soldiers vote? A lot of these people are no longer in the country.
Right, it's an extremely complicated election to organise because you've got about 5 million men serving overseas. And there is absolutely no question of holding an election in which those people can't vote. So you've got to come up with a system. So essentially, a special service list is compiled by which soldiers and sailors and members of the Air Force can appoint a proxy, but they also have the option of sending in a postal vote. And around 2/3, I think, of soldiers do vote through one of those two mechanisms. But of course, it means that parts of the armed forces simply can't be reached. You can just about fly in votes from India. You can't fly in votes from Australia or New Zealand. It's just not practical at this time. So that's a serious difficulty. You've also got a problem with civilians as well, actually. They've been bombed out of their houses or they've moved to work in a different part of the country. So it's a very difficult election to organise. And partly for that reason, this is a unique election in that although polling day is mostly on the 5th of July, returning officers then sit on the votes for 3 weeks and they're not actually counted until the 26th of July. And it's a comment that's often made in the foreign media that it's a mark of, if you like, the sort of stability of British government and of trust in British democracy, that voters actually trust their government to sit on these ballots for 3 weeks without trying to nobble the contest.
And it's not like 1906. So as you described in 1906, which was a rolling election played out over weeks, the results were announced so that the public were given a chance in other parts of the country to correct for the foolishness of their compatriots somewhere else. And as you described it, some politicians could scramble from one end of the country to the other looking for a safe seat. We are now in the era where the results are going to be announced in one go, but they're going to be held on to. So there is the election night shock with this election. The results come through, and Churchill and many, many other people are amazed to discover what the British public, including 5 million soldiers, have decided they want for the world after the war. There is a real, I think maybe for the first time, because it all happens effectively on one night, it's an event that I think many of us are familiar with from recent years, which is at some point overnight, you discover that the world has changed.
Yes, and if you live somewhere like London, then you can see results being projected up onto big screens in the centre of London, and that's an exciting experience. It's perhaps worth saying that it's an unusual election in the democratic era in that some constituencies do vote later. And the reason for that, it's nothing to do with the war. It's because the 5th of July coincides with Wakes Week in a number of northern towns. And this was a sort of popular fair with its roots in the working class and the trade union movement. And you can't possibly hold an election when, the carnival is going through town. So there's a small number of seats where they simply have to move the election a couple of weeks later.
Wow. Attlee becomes Prime Minister. The war is still going on. And he inherits a mind-boggling array of international questions that are going to need resolving. And the politician whom he resembles in some ways is the man who also, at roughly the same time, becomes American president. I don't know how often people draw this parallel, but when you think about it, there is something uncanny about what had been a world in which the dominant politicians were Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. And this was how the war was going to end, with these three carving up the world. And within a matter of months, 2 of them are swapped out. And you get Truman and Attlee. And Truman, like Attlee, is not someone who 5 years earlier people would have predicted was going to be one of the people carving up the future of the world. Like Attlee, he'd fought in the First World War, but he was, in political terms, thought to be a fairly unassuming figure. He was in some ways an accidental president. And he got the vice presidency at the last minute. When he became president, one commentator said, this is the first time that America is genuinely experimenting with democracy, because if this man could be president, anybody could be president. So we might as well have stuck in a random person off the street. And yet these two people inherited a set of international quandaries and dilemmas on a scale that no one had ever experienced before. So in Attlee's case, he's elected on a domestic program. There is a certain amount in the manifesto about how the world is going to be made secure in the peace, but it is very, very much a domestic program. And yet so many of the challenges that he's going to face are ones that require an international perspective. Is it possible to say, as he takes office and then as his administration develops, how far he is effectively the prisoner of that international context? We think of it as a great domestic reforming administration. I'm guessing the bulk of his time was spent on the great questions of reordering a new international order.
Yes, it's a government that is hugely shaped and constrained by international affairs, and it's hard to see how it could have been otherwise. As you say, the Second World War is still going on at the time that he takes office, so there is still a war going on in the East. Even after that point, you've got 5 million men serving overseas, and a sense that that number isn't going to shrink radically over the years to come, because you've got the reorganization after the war. You've got imperial wars breaking out and an empire that has been destabilized. You've got the beginnings of the Cold War. You've got the nuclear age. And that absorbs huge amounts of government time, but it also actually shapes its financial room for maneuver. It's an interesting thing I like to share with students about the Attlee government, that if you had to guess what it spends most of its money on, most people guess the NHS. The NHS is only the 4th biggest item of expenditure under the Attlee government. The top of the list is military spending. It's spending about £780 million in 1951 on the armed forces. The second highest element on the list is debt repayment. simply paying back the colossal sums of money that were borrowed in order to fight the war. So the exchequer is still completely in a kind of wartime prison. The third item on the list actually is food subsidies. It's spending enormous amounts of money buying up food from around the world and providing them at affordable prices to the public. When the Korean War breaks out, the Labour government finds itself having to do things that are wretchedly painful to its supporters, like considering prescription charges or dental charges. So in a way, the Attlee government is wrestling with the dilemma that faces, I think, every Labour government until the 1990s, which is how does it balance the costs of a global role, which is very much a role that Labour governments want to play, with the constraints that places on its ability to be radical in domestic policy.
And a global role here means an imperial role too. So the manifesto has a little bit about Indian self-determination, but nothing about dismantling an empire. Attlee, as you say, went to Haileybury. I believe Haileybury was the school that was designed to be where you trained up the future imperialists. That was its role. It's the Indian Civil Service Training College. So this great reforming Labour Prime Minister is a product of the Indian Civil Service Training College. And to run an empire on that scale is an enormous obligation and an enormous drain, and also, presumably in political terms, highly contentious within the party. Attlee is not going to dismantle the British Empire, but how hard was it to hold the party together on these questions?
Yes, as you say, Attlee is very much an imperial statesman. He's forged in an imperial educational system. And Britain has just won the war as an empire. If you look back at Winston Churchill's speeches, we tend to forget this now. They're very much about if the British Empire and Commonwealth should last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour. So it was a war that in some sense was seen as endorsing and justifying the British imperial product as a force for freedom in the world. The idea that this is all going to collapse, really, by the late 1960s is not on many people's political agenda, except obviously in cases like Indian independence. So it's still a party that assumes that it's in power to govern an empire, but it does believe in a sort of radical socialist vision of empire. So the word Commonwealth, which you mentioned earlier, starts to come into wider use during this period, that what you have here potentially is the most extraordinary global alliance drawn from all different races, bringing together people of radically different religions, dedicated to their mutual improvement and enhancement. So Labour puts lots of money into kind of colonial development projects, most of which don't actually work. But it has a different vision of what empire could be. It's historically, of course, a blip, because this turns out not to be sustainable. But there is a sense that Labour isn't simply perpetuating the empire of the past. It's trying to claw towards some kind of socialist empire of the future.
What lesson did the Conservatives take from their defeat? So Churchill sulked for quite a long time, I believe. The party could have concluded that he was a liability, given that the Labour Party very, very successfully managed to tie him back to a period of Conservative government and governance from which the party would have to move on if it was ever going to be in government again. And yet they stuck with him. I don't know whether it was ever in question that they would stick with him. I mean, I don't know what people thought in 1945, but some people presumably would have been surprised to know that Churchill, nonetheless, would still come back as a peacetime prime minister. He had never been a peacetime prime minister, and he seemed very unsuited to being a peacetime prime minister. But they stuck with him. Having said that, presumably they also drew the lesson that the ground had shifted significantly on the central questions of economic management, and there was no mileage in Hayek, for instance.
Yes, so to some extent, the question of the leadership is not a great priority in 1945 because they've suffered such a shattering defeat that there's no expectation that they're coming back to government, at the very least in this parliament, and probably for very much longer. So attention focuses less on who should lead the party and more on what the party should stand for. And there is a strong recognition that the party needs a radically new policy platform. And so, to its credit, it launches an enormous number of policy studies. It engages in a very big program of political education. It expands its policy-making machinery. It works very hard to rebuild a youth organisation, which means that by the time you get to the next election in 1950, it has really quite a coherent and in many ways attractive programme that combines a kind of reassuring message on welfare, that we're going to protect and indeed improve your welfare services, with one that can say to a country that's starting to get a bit tired of rationing and economic controls and the really difficult economic conditions that continue for years after the war, that actually there's more of a market at that point for saying the state's going to step back, we're going to liberalise, we're going to unleash entrepreneurialism and the free market than there had been in 1945.
And were they successfully able to blame the Labour Party for those constraints? So Churchill in 1945 goes way too far in saying that what you're going to get is a government which will in the end have to fall back on control and various kinds of autocratic measures. By 1950, was it plausible for the Conservative Party to say, actually, we can do welfare, we can look after people too, but what you're going to get from the Labour Party is that step too far. There's more control, there's more bureaucracy, there's more constraint than is necessary here.
Yeah, so we talked earlier about how in 1945, in the sense that the fates are all against the Conservatives. In a way, by 1950, the fates are all against the Labour Party. They've been governing during an exceptionally difficult period. Even the weather is appalling. Which has a real effect on standards of living. You have very cold winters. Rationing is actually extended in the years after the war. Rationing is extended to things like bread that hadn't been rationed during the war. So the sense that we won the war, we made the sacrifices, but the peace hasn't delivered, the sacrifices are continuing, is more powerful in 1950 than anyone, I think, would have predicted in 1945. But I think it's important to say that there's often a sort of story that's told about the end of the Attlee government, which is that you have an electorate that is sick and tired of rationing, is sick and tired of controls, and rebels against that. In fact, the Labour Party increased its vote in the 1950 election, and it increased it even further in the 1951 election. In 1951, it won 48.8% of the vote, which is a record. It's higher than the Conservatives did, but they lost that election. So they won a landslide in 1945 on fewer votes than they lost an election in 1951. And that's not so much about what the people thought as about the distribution of Labour support around the country and the way that first past the post can punish you, depending upon where your support base actually is.
And was it also a squeeze of the Liberals? Because the Conservatives in 1945, as you say, got 39% of the vote. Labour didn't get up to 48 until 1951, but the Conservatives come all the way back. They squeeze out everyone who might steal a vote from them, so that's the way they're able to restore their fortunes.
They do, and they very much present themselves as a kind of liberal party in Tory clothing, that you get slogans like set the people free, that they're going to release the country from planning controls, from building regulations, the extraordinary restrictions on how many sweets you could buy, how much coffee you could buy. And at the same time, the Labour Party is having a bit of a breakdown over the future of controls, because on the one hand, it knows that this is unpopular, and its vision of the future isn't one in which you have to take your ration book to the shops in order to get your allocation of tea and sugar. But on the other hand, there's a wing of the party that thinks this is stage one, and we are moving towards a more socialised economy. We started with the commanding heights, the railways, the coal mines, the steelworks, but actually our constitution, clause 4, commits the party to the collective ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange. So what are we going to do next? So industries like steel that have stayed out in the early stages of privatisation become big political battlegrounds. The sugar industry fights a very successful campaign against nationalisation. So Labour isn't sure any longer where it stands. It hasn't got that clear economic message it had in 1945, whereas the Conservatives now do.
As someone who attended for journalistic reasons the launch of Liz Truss's popular Conservative movement quite recently, I heard a prospective parliamentary candidate for the Conservative Party rail against what was coming under Keir Starmer, which would be a curtailment of an Englishman's God-given right to buy 2 packets of biscuits. We're going to be restricted to 1 each, apparently, when the real nanny state kicks in.
Well, Tate and Lyle, the sugar company, run a brilliantly successful publicity campaign in which they launch a character called Mr. Cube, who is a sugar cube with a sword, who is a rather sort of dashing character who fights off various socialist enemies and socialist snakes. And it's very clever, it's very funny, and it's really hitting a nerve, I think, in terms of the case against Labour at this point, because they're deliberately not having an argument about who should run the coal mines. They're having an argument about sugar, about sweets, about jam, about the kind of items that bring a little bit of pleasure to the ordinary person's life. It's a very well-chosen campaign. And actually, if people want to, they can find videos of Mr. Cube on YouTube that are very much worth watching.
So I just want to draw one parallel and one question. This is the Great Labour landslide until the landslide of 1997. That's the second one. Harold Wilson does pretty well in 1966, but these are the two totemic Labour landslides. And now it looks like we may well be on the cusp of the third. And the Attlee administration, not just the election victory, but the administration has always had a totemic quality in Labour's history and its understanding of itself. And Labour governments are often compared with the Attlee government. Do they have the ambition and so on? And a Labour majority on this scale is very, very rare. One of the things that is interesting now relative to 45, and 97 is similar, but I think this might be an even more extreme example, is Labour may win the biggest majority in its history in 2024 on, by historical standards, not a particularly big vote share. There are polls, I've seen polls, if Reform does really well, if the Liberal Democrats do really well, and you get a kind of four-way squeeze, a three-way squeeze of the opposition, in which Labour win the biggest majority in its history with 38% of the vote. That's not that many people voting Labour. That's fewer than 2 in 5 people voting Labour, and they could end up with 60% of MPs, 65% of MPs, maybe even more. It is one of the quirks of the first past the post system is not simply that third parties get squeezed, but winning parties get hugely inflated. And there is a real danger in that. That mismatch is there. There have been other examples too. 2005, when Blair won a big majority, sort of Harold Wilson style majority, on 35% of the vote on a 60% turnout. Nobody voted Labour in that election. 1 in 5 people voted Labour of the electorate, and they had a huge majority by Labour Party standards. And 1945, it does seem like it is at least potentially a warning here. There is a slight mismatch between popular enthusiasm and electoral outcomes in the Commons under first past the post. Do you see that? Do you have a sense that that could be where there is a parallel here? And after all, that thumping majority it only lasted 5 years, and the government only lasted 6, and then Labour were out of power again until 1964.
Yeah, so I think there are two warnings here. The first is that Labour doesn't win big majorities very often. In the whole of the 20th century, it only does so 3 times. 1945, very odd election, obviously because of the context of the war, 1966 when the whole country's on drugs, and 1997 under Tony Blair. So it doesn't win big majorities often, and when it does, it tends to lose them quite quickly. So Attlee wins in 1945, but is out in 1951. Wilson wins that big majority in 1966, and then is out in 1970. And New Labour drew from that the lesson that they had to govern in a different way in order to build across a number of terms. And so that sets up a question: what's best for a progressive party? A short government in which you produce lasting transformation, as Attlee did, or a much longer government in which you are necessarily more cautious over time? So that's the kind of dilemma that Labour will face again if they win big in 2024.
And there was a fourth big majority. It's not in the 20th century, but in 2001. But as you say, it's a sort of like a frozen majority. And with hindsight, many people in the Labour Party think that the 97 to 2001 Parliament and administration was wasted as we're holding on to that majority rather than using it.
Quite, but I think that's a deliberate political calculation by Tony Blair and the New Labour leadership, that they do not want to be a one-term Labour government. They want to break that pattern. Before Tony Blair, no Labour leader had ever won 2 full terms in a row. New Labour wins 3. So in terms of electoral success, it outperforms Attlee and Wilson. In terms of its policy achievements, of course, that's a much more debatable question. So that's definitely a dilemma for the Labour Party. And on your point about winning on a very large majority on a very small share of the vote, I think that is a very serious danger. First past the post is a very fickle master, and historically that has tended to punish the Labour Party or parties of the left. So in 1951, Attlee wins 13.95 million votes, which is a record that stands until 1992. He wins a bigger share of the vote than the Tories, but he loses. In 1983, the SDP Liberal Alliance, the precursors of the Liberal Democrats, come 2 percentage points behind Labour. They win about a quarter of the vote, and they win 24 seats. So first past the post has tended to punish parties of the left or the centre-left. In this election, there's a very good chance that it punishes the parties of the right, and that the Conservative Party wins a derisory share of seats on perhaps 20 or more percent of the vote, and that Reform wins almost no seats on a vote at least in the teens. If that happens, I think it would be very interesting to see what happens in the debate about proportional representation. Once the right decide that first past the post isn't very good for them, then that's something that we haven't really seen before in the politics of the last century.
Just a reminder, if you want to hear this series in chronological order, including the bonus episode on 1924, just sign up to PPF Plus, where you will get all our bonus episodes and ad-free listening. Click on the link in the show description. Next time, I'm talking to Robert Saunders about the election of 1979, the election that saw Margaret Thatcher arrive in Downing Street. Was it a foregone conclusion, or could it have turned out quite differently? This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.